Welcome to our Wesley Bible class. Today we're going to be going through the last part of chapter 15 and getting into chapter 16 of Deuteronomy. So, the first part of chapter 15 had to do with laws of the sabbatical year. The year of Jubilee, every 6 or 7 years was a year of Jubilee, and a lot of things got stopped. Just like there is a Sabbath day in the week, there is a Sabbath year in the calendar. And so on the 7th year, slaves are set free if they are Hebrew. Debts are canceled. And something that's not mentioned in here is that the land lies fallow for a year. So you better make the best you can in 6 years, or the 7th year is going to be pretty tough. So anyway, that's the year of Jubilee, and we celebrate that in songs, and most people don't even know what Jubilee is all about when they sing about it, but go back to Deuteronomy and find out. Okay, the last part has to do with the sacrifice of the firstborn livestock. If you haven't read the previous chapters of the Pentateuch, you might not know what this is all about. So let's explain it, okay? Every firstling male born of your herd and flock you shall consecrate to the Lord your God. You shall not do work with your firstling ox, nor shear the firstling of your flock. You shall eat it, you together with your household, in the presence of the Lord your God, year by year, at the place that the Lord will choose. But if it has any defect, any serious defect, such as lameness or blindness, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. Within your towns you may eat it, the unclean and the clean alike, as you would a gazelle or deer. Its blood, however, you must not eat. You shall pour it out on the ground like water. Okay, what is this all about? Well, this goes back to Passover and the laws of Moses. As you know, what was going on at Passover? What happened at Passover?
God passed over their donkeys.
And okay, God passed over.
Did not kill the firstborn.
Did not kill the firstborn of their house. Okay? Did kill the firstborn of the Egyptians. Not just the firstborn son, but killed the firstborn animals of the Egyptians as well. So it was a bad night for the Egyptians. Okay, so what's this got to do with it? Well, under the law of Moses, firstborn son was consecrated to God. Now, that sounds good. I know that there are some traditions in Christendom that don't like to do infant baptisms, but they do consecrations. Okay? You have to understand that if something is consecrated to God in the Pentateuch, it means that it's going to get killed. Okay? So, like enemy populations were consecrated to God. They were all going to be killed. Firstborn of your flock, the idea, and this is a kind of a fertility thing. You kill the firstborn, and God will guarantee a secondborn. But the firstborn son is consecrated to God, which means that, like anything else firstborn, it ought to be killed. But there's a provision in the Pentateuch that you could redeem your firstborn son by having an animal sacrificed in that child's stead. Okay? So the idea is that the firstborn sons of Israel would be redeemed through an alternate sacrifice. And this is the basis for what we have in Christendom, in that Christ was God's firstborn son, sacrificed to redeem us. So the concept of something being sacrificed so that something else could be redeemed goes all the way back to the first books of the Bible. I don't know exactly the rationale for that, except that it was a decree. It was part of the law of Moses. But the principle is what we rely on for our own redemption. Through the sacrifice of Christ, we are redeemed. Okay? So, and the sacrifice has to be pure, can't have any defects. And you'll see that while it is sacrificed to the Lord, it becomes a meal. Okay? But anyway, that's the whole tie-in for sacrificing the firstborn. Everything that is firstborn is consecrated to God, which doesn't bode well for the firstborn.
Yeah, but they
Is
never
that-
did that.
Huh?
They never really, I know the Baal and all those guys that worship idols, they, would give their children,
Yes.
sacrifice them, but this group of Israelites did not do that.
No, they did not do that.
I mean, what I'm rationalizing is, these are the laws that they have made. It
Yes.
doesn't necessarily mean that they ever carried them out.
Well, that became a problem whenever they didn't carry out the
No,
laws.
but I'm talking about this specific one. Why would they even sacrifice their firstborn?
Well, you have an example in Abraham, where God told him to sacrifice his firstborn. Actually, it was his secondborn.
I guess that would show your total dedication to God.
That's exactly right. And what God is telling them is, you look and see what these pagans are doing. Your dedication to me can't be anything less than theirs, to their idols.
Is it always males only, or do
Yep.
the firstborn females, or?
Yep, you've got enough to deal with. There was one instance of a female being sacrificed in the Old Testament, and it was because the daddy was stupid.
The daddy was stupid.
The daddy was stupid, yeah. He wasn't even a Hebrew. He was a Gentile general who was part of the Israelite army. And he made a promise that if he would win the battle, that he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of the tent to greet him. And sure enough, it was his daughter. Yep. And he sure enough did sacrifice her, you know? Too bad, so sad.
Wow.
Dennis, what happened if somebody got caught not sacrificing firstborn?
Well,
That's a good question.
that is a good question. They don't put a penalty in there. Okay? They don't put a penalty in there, but you can see that when people deviated from the law of God, the whole community suffered. So they would, I think somebody who did not sacrifice their firstborn animal would probably be ostracized, or there'd be some kind of societal sanction. Yeah, but the penalty for not doing this is not included. Okay, but that gives us, from 15 to 16, that gives us a tie-in, because in chapter 16 they talk about reviving the Passover dinner. Okay, so in 16 it says, observe the month of Abib, and keep the Passover for the Lord your God. For the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd at the place that the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name, which means Jerusalem. Okay? You must not eat with it any leaven, anything leavened. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, because you came out of the land of Egypt in great haste. So the idea is you have unleavened bread because when you beat feet out of Egypt, you had to go quick and you didn't have time to let the bread rise. Okay? So that all the days of your life you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt. No leaven shall be seen with you. Okay, I'm out of here. In all your territory for 7 days, and none of the meat of which you of what you slaughter in the evening of the first day shall remain until morning. Okay, let me share an anecdote. My dad was a great trickster. And you can imagine, if you've read anything about what my mom did, let me tell you what my dad did. Whenever we had missionaries come through on what they called a sabbatical, they worked them to death on the sabbatical, going around and explaining their missions so that churches would support their missions. But they didn't have two pennies to rub together. And so they would stay with us in the parsonage. We didn't get a motel. And it was fascinating because, I sat at dinner table with these people from around the world and, heard their stories and stuff that they wouldn't tell in church. And we had one fellow show up from Africa, and he was a surgeon. And he had given up a very fine practice to go into the ministry and in the mission field. And boy, I'll tell you, that guy was just broke. He made nothing. He didn't make enough to pay the phone bill. He was that down. But anyway, he showed up. We never met him before, and so Dad told me, listen, when he gets here, just go along with me. That was always something. So his name was Dr. Brown, and anyway, Dr. Brown showed up. And we greeted him at the parsonage end of the church. The parsonage was part of the church, and so Dad said, "Oh, we're so glad to see you, Dennis. Get his bag." So I got his bag, and he says, "Come with me. We got your place all set up." And so he walked from the parsonage part into the sanctuary, and then all the way to the back of the sanctuary, and then up into the balcony of the church. And the ceiling of the balcony was the trap door into the steeple. And Dad climbed up a ladder and opened the trap door into the steeple, which was not floored. And he said, "Got your room ready? Come on up." And so the missionary started up the ladder. He said, "Dennis, hand him the bag," And he goes up there, looks around. He's like, "Huh?" Wind's blowing through the steeple. And we finally started laughing. He got it. Okay, he was going to stay in Grandma's room, but Grandma was gone, by the way. But anyway, got him back down. Yeah. Well, later on, I was in college, and it was a Nazarene college, and they had chapel. You had to go to chapel. You didn't have to go to class necessarily. Had to go to chapel, and the preacher in the chapel happened to be Dr. Brown. And the title of his sermon was "That Awful Leaven." So I went up to him afterwards, I introduced myself, and I said, "I think I know where you got your sermon title." But anyway, different spelling, okay? Anyway, thought you'd get a rise out of that. So anyway, you can't eat any leavened bread. You are not permitted to offer the Passover sacrifice within any of your towns that the Lord your God has given you, but at the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, only there you shall offer the Passover sacrifice in the evening at sunset, the time of day when you departed from Egypt. You shall cook it and eat it at the place that the Lord your God will choose. The next morning you may go back to your tents. For 6 days you shall continue to eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a solemn assembly for the Lord your God, when you shall do no work. Okay, they are ostensibly living in tents. They are on their way through the wilderness, and they're going to eat the Passover. But the connotation that you have in here is that there is a special place that the Lord has designated for you to partake of the sacrifice and partake of the Passover. Okay, so where is that place? It's Jerusalem, which means that this was written about an Exodus time, but it was written from the standpoint of a settled community that had cities that were scattered all over, and the idea was that you come back to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And that's one of the reasons why in the New Testament you see that Jesus is going to go back to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover with his disciples. Okay? Now, this is a very special Passover time. It's one of the reasons why we have a fairly good idea of how to date this event, and in conjunction with that, it gives us an idea of how old Jesus probably was at the time of his crucifixion, which would be about 33 years. This particular Passover was going to happen when there was a convergence of Passover with the Sabbath. Okay? So Passover was going to happen with a Saturday, which means that the day of preparation for Passover, when you killed the Passover lamb, was Friday. So Friday is the day of preparation. If you get this, you don't get this from the Synoptic Gospels, the first three. You get it from John's Gospel, which is much more accurate when it comes to understanding the rites and rituals of Judaism. Okay? So when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, very often that's presented in Christendom from the standpoint of the first three chapters, or the first three books of the Gospels, okay, which were written by Gentiles. And their understanding was that the Last Supper was the Passover supper, okay? It was not. You don't have any reference in that supper to lamb being served, okay? And Jesus, being the Lamb of God, was killed on the day of preparation in John's Gospel.
So
Okay?
he was killed on Friday.
He was killed on Friday. Okay? So the reason why they wanted, the Sanhedrin wanted the bodies removed from the crosses is that they didn't want any dead bodies hanging around for the next day, which was Passover. So that was the urgency for taking Jesus down from the cross on the day that he died, because normally the Romans would just leave him up there to rot until the next candidate came along. So they removed the bodies. They made sure that they were dead before sundown on Friday, and that was consistent because sundown Friday is when Sabbath begins. Okay, so you can see in John's Gospel there's a much better rationale for the events that took place over the time of the Last Supper all the way through the crucifixion.
So Passover was the day after Jesus died?
Yes.
I'd never heard that before.
Yep. Well, it's in John's Gospel.
Well, if
Okay.
you say so.
Well, three Gospels say that it wasn't. One Gospel, and I really like the Gospel of John. Okay. You see in the first three Gospels that were written by Gentiles, there was really not as good an understanding of Jewish tradition in those three Gospels. But in the Gospel of John, you do. You see a very good, in-depth understanding of Jewish tradition and rites and rituals. So I like to go with John's Gospel. And I have a hunch that John was I believe that John was Jewish, but he didn't necessarily grow up in Palestine. Okay?
You say Matthew, Mark, and Luke were Gentiles?
Yeah.
Really?
Well,
I never knew
Luke, certainly.
Paul was too, wasn't
Huh?
he? The Apostle Paul was.
No, Paul was not. He was a Jew.
Oh, he was?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I never knew that.
Yeah.
I just remember he was persecuting the Jews when he was blinded by the light, you know.
Yeah.
But it says that Matthew was likely a Jewish convert,
Yes.
so he was Jew before.
Yeah.
No, he couldn't have been a Gentile. If
He was a Gentile and converted to Jewish
Right, yeah.
Judaism.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I never knew that.
Yeah. But there is not as good an understanding of Jewish tradition in the first three Gospels as there is in John.
So did they not give a timeline in those three that showed it was Passover, or did they say it wasn't Passover?
They don't indicate, well, they do indicate that it was a Passover, you know.
I thought on
But I'm not sure if that was the way it was translated. It could have been, you know, Jesus desired to eat this meal with you, but it might have been represented in some Gospels as desired to eat this Passover with you, okay? But John's Gospel is much more in sync with the events themselves and explain the events themselves much better.
Well, the early Bible was put together by Jews, correct?
Not the New Testament,
The New Testament was not.
yeah.
Who put them together? Who put the New Testament?
Mostly Gentile communities.
Are we Gentiles that, before we gave our hearts to Jesus? What are we? What are we considered?
We're Gentiles.
Well, you got to understand
I
that the
thought you
Jews
gotta
and
be
Gentiles
specific.
all had to give their hearts to Jesus if they're going to be Christian, okay? So there wasn't that distinction. What you have to understand is that the language that the Aramaic was translated into was primarily a Gentile language. It was Greek, okay? And it was gutter Greek. It was the language of business. It wasn't High Greek, classical Greek. It was, you know, familiar Greek, the kind of Greek that you'd use if you were going anywhere in the Roman world to conduct business, because that was the language of business. So it's just like if you went around the world today, people would be doing business primarily in English, and but they might not speak English as well or have, you know, a different way of expressing it. Just ask the Brits. But understand that Greek was the common language of the Western world. And so when they translated it into Greek. And something you need to be aware of also is that the only people outside of officialdom, this is the reason why it's not classical Greek, the only people outside of officialdom that were writing things, okay, so I'm not talking about government, I'm not talking about the temple, which would not have had any interest at that time in translating the words of Jesus, okay? The only ones who were translating that were people who were doing business. So you had accountants writing the basic scriptures on which everything else was built, okay? So an accountant would sit down and say, tell me some of the things that Jesus said. And then they'd write it down in Greek. Okay? So you might not know the context because they would have a list of Jesus' sayings. Okay? You're not talking about putting together a narrative necessarily. So when the people put together what we call the scriptures, okay, the New Testament, they were putting together these lists that were put together by primarily accountants and trying to fit them into the context of the stories that the disciples had passed on. Because these Gospels were written a long time after the disciples were gone. Okay? So they're trying to recapture it. So whoever was writing this was trying to capture what the disciples were saying, and then including in there the kind of verbatim quotes of Jesus and the events of Jesus, but they were put together in list-like categories. And one of the reasons we know that is so is that these things were not written on scrolls. The official documents were written on scrolls, okay? These were written on papyrus, and they were written in a codex, what we call codex. And codex is like a book. It's got pages. And to be economical, you could write on both sides of it. Okay? On a scroll, you only wrote on one side, and the scroll is made of sheepskin, and it wasn't cheap. So official documentation was not put on codex. But if you were a businessman, you were writing things in codex.
And are any of these still available today?
No.
So
We have copies. We have, I mean, the oldest copies go back to maybe 300 AD, if that.
So we have the old copies are still in existence.
Some, yeah. Yeah.
What was on the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Old Testament things, nothing New Testament. Okay, you had, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written during what we call the intertestamental period. So between Old and New Testament, there was a group of Essenes in Qumran that were trying, see, the main Bible that everybody was using was the Septuagint, which was Greek. Okay? And so what the Essenes were trying to do was to get from the Greek and from scrolls that they had available in Hebrew, they were trying to recapture a language that wasn't even being used anymore, which was ancient Hebrew. So they were trying to rewrite the Septuagint in Hebrew. And that's where we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they were pretty good at their scholarly work. And so you have a differentiation. Now, most of our current Bible is based on the Septuagint. It's based on the Greek Old Testament. And one of the reasons for that is that these people were familiar with the Greek. So, you know, it's Roman society, they understood Greek.
Was there a big difference when you go from the I guess the original Bible when they did the St. James
King
version?
James, he was not a saint.
It was what?
He was not a saint, he was a
No.
king. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, and they almost killed him.
how come they call him St. James?
They don't call him St. James.
Okay.
Yeah, he is King James.
Oh, you're right, you're right.
Yeah. If you read the original King James, you could not read the original King James. It was written in Old English. Okay? And it's almost like reading Beowulf. So it's just, you know.
But there was the Peshitta was
The Peshitta, yeah. Peshitta was a later translation that brought from the Greek into the Aramaic. So you had a better understanding of the language they were translating out of when the Peshitta was written. Okay? Because it didn't have... The Peshitta is much more faithful to Jewish heritage and to the language that Jesus spoke, which was not Hebrew, it was ancient Persian, which is Aramaic.
He spoke Persian?
Yes. Old Persian. That was his common tongue, was Aramaic.
Jesus.
Jesus.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he didn't speak Hebrew. He could read Hebrew because he was taught to read Hebrew.
So are you saying that the Gospels, especially the first three, were not actually written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but were transcribed later from things they said?
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And
don't know how
and
much
so
of that-
what you
I
have.
really don't know how much of this is actually true.
Yep.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke were the ones that wrote those books.
That's right.
Yeah, they are the people that the information was primarily derived from. It was the stories that Matthew and Mark and Luke passed on for someone to write down. Okay? Now, I am not an eminent scholar by any means, but I really think that the author of John's Gospel was John.
Well, they
Okay,
say
John
that the
Mark.
other three took a lot of their,
Yeah.
from John,
No.
Mark, Luke, John. No,
Okay, no, what they mostly took their information from, and we do not have this document.
Mark.
Okay, we do not have this document, but scholars refer to it as Q. Okay, and it comes from the German word of Quelle, which is story. Okay, apparently the Quelle document was something that was written by some of these accountants. Okay? So you have the same wording in the first three Gospels, which is why they're called synoptics. They all see it the same way. But you'll see the placement of those events in different contexts in the three Gospels. Okay? But the primary source document, the quotes of Jesus, the events of Jesus, came from Q. John is not so tied to Q as the other Gospels. So John has a different interpretation of what was going on in the life of Jesus than you saw in the previous Gospels. Now, each Gospel has its own theme. You know, Mark was trying to put together essentially a concise history of the events of Jesus' life. Matthew had an agenda, and the agenda was to prove to the Jewish community that Jesus was the Messiah that was predicted. Okay, that was Matthew's agenda. Luke's agenda, because Luke lived in this world that was Gentile and Jewish, Luke was trying to convince Roman authorities, and you see this because he also wrote Acts. He was trying to convince the Roman authorities that this new Christianity thing was no threat to the empire. That there was a much better relationship between Jesus and Gentiles than is presented in the previous Gospels. Okay, so Jesus was not a threat to the Roman Empire. And that's one of the reasons why you see a more benign presentation of Pilate, you know, not so much that Jesus is interested in overthrowing the Roman authorities. He had much more to criticize within his own community, the authorities in his own community, than he did in the Roman government. You know, he wasn't advocating that people not pay taxes. You know, you see all this kind of stuff happening in Luke. So his agenda was, hey, we're not a threat to the society. You don't need to persecute us, which is a big deal because this thing came out of Judaism, and at that time Judaism was being persecuted by the Roman Empire, so they don't get lumped in with them. Okay?
What exactly is Judaism?
What
How they
we're-
worship?
As Judaism,
Jewish,
Judaism
right?
is both a religion, it is a religion, it is a culture, and it is an ethnicity.
How do they worship?
They
Do
worship,
Jesus.
no.
I
No,
always thought that the Judaism meant Jews, but it was. the
It does.
Jews, just because it had Jew in it.
right, that's right.
Oh, it is right.
That's correct. Okay, but they do not worship Jesus as Christ. They consider him a prophet, but they don't worship him as Son of God or anything like that.
Hence, they were saying he was rejected by his own people.
Yes, he was.
So that makes.
Yeah, they kind of put him on the cross kind of thing, you know, that's, I consider that a rejection of sorts. So, anyway, where'd we get there to this point? But, you know, your Bible is not consistent in the way it presents virtually anything. And so there are wide variations. And so you need to be very careful that you understand the context in which things were written and why they were written, so that you get the bias. Yeah, it's just like here, you know, describing Passover. On the one hand, there's describing Passover as something that everybody celebrates, and you go back to your tents and that sort of thing, as if you all have tents. Okay, but at the same time, they're talking about a place that God designates. Okay, and that place is Jerusalem, which they're not there yet. So you have this historical tension going on between what was and what was to become.
Well, didn't they probably, when they were living in the wilderness, have a spot, a place?
Yeah, it was, any place that the tabernacle was placed. Okay? But
they
by
have
the
been
time,
talking
by the
about
time
that?
of this writing, there was a temple.
Right.
Yeah. So it's kind of a history that's looking ahead to what is. We're going to get into some of that in the sermon today. I don't know how I'm going to get out of it, but anyway. We're going to be looking at Isaiah. So we're going to have some interesting things with that. I hope they're interesting. Don't all leave. Okay. Anyway, you're supposed to run the Passover dinner. Now, this is another thing to understand. You eat the Passover dinner as if you are in Egypt. You're going to eat it the same way. You're going to eat it fast. You're going to eat it with no leftovers. There's no takeout plates in Passover. Okay? So you eat the whole thing. You eat it quickly at sundown, and right when the meal is over, you're supposed to get out of Egypt. When the scriptures, when the ritual is read at Passover, it is not written in the past tense. It is written in the present tense. We are enslaved in Egypt. Okay? It is, the present generation is to experience Passover as if they were the ancient generation.
So it says that they can't have leftovers, they can't throw them away. They are
No.
not supposed to share them with anybody. So do they do a bird?
They just, you gotta eat it all. So you better plan the meal pretty well.
Right.
Yeah.
No.
It's not like my freezer that's got turkeys from 3 years ago.
Yeah,
Okay.
one day you'll enjoy that turkey.
I will, and have.
So what was the purpose in that not having any leftovers and not letting anybody else have it? Why?
Well, for one thing, you didn't want to be out of your house when the death angel came through.
Oh, I know that, but you could have left your food on the table.
Well, maybe they could have, but you know,
It was just a
We're-
rule that
they were-
put their foot down.
let's just say that they were not environmentally sensitive at that point. Okay. And generally speaking, if you're talking about a people who are enslaved and where food was scarce, nobody talked about leftovers anyway.
I just think it's interesting that they have put that in there. That, you know, if you can't eat it all, don't share it.
That's
Well,
it.
the manna you weren't supposed to
No,
eat.
overnight,
I think
you
it's-
ate it then.
Probably the same
Well,
thing to show that God will
would
provide
provide,
each day.
Right.
Just see.
Yeah, that was the other thing, is that they were supposed to be entirely dependent on God for their sustenance on the trip. And look at the manna, you know, no leftover manna. Better eat that stuff quick, you know.
So, when they're in Egypt,
Yeah.
when they have left Egypt, and they're all in their own tents, from their own places where they live, each family sacrifices something.
Right.
To make sure they eat it all.
That's correct.
They don't go next door to the tent and say, we had a little left over.
Hey, it's just a lamb. I mean, you know,
Not like today, huh?
not that much.
Okay.
All right,
But
well,
they didn't have food then, when they were after they left Egypt. God was providing manna for them.
not right away. They had to complain first. Great stories. Okay, well, we've gone over, but choir's not singing today, so I guess that's why you all hang around. But good to have you with us, and we're going to pick it up again in chapter 16 next week, so be with us.
Chapter 16 of what?
Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy.
Yep. Okay, God bless.
Danny,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.